I never got an Atari 2600, which everybody wanted an Atari back in the late 70s. And I never got a computer until I was almost 13. And for Christmas in 1983, I got a Commodore 64, which was my first computer, but also the Commodore 64 had tons of games, joysticks, and accepted game cartridges. And so that was my first real gaming system. Back then, you could share games on floppy disks and everything. I also ended up getting my first modem when I was 14, and you could call into bulletin boards, BBSs, and download free games. But the Commodore, the sad thing about the Commodore 64 for me is I had that from when I was just turning 13. Anyway, when I was somewhere around 21, my mom had a garage sale, and she asked me if I wanted to sell anything, and I put a bunch of baseball cards and different things down there, but I didn't really care. Well, I come back, and without even telling me, she had put out my Commodore 64,
No.
the printer, the floppy, everything for like $25. Now, it's worth way more than I ever bought it for. It sure would be sort of cool to go back and look at some of the stuff. But if you go back to the Atari 2600, back in when I was like 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, whoever had an Atari in the neighborhood, everyone wanted to go hang out at their house. And my friend, we were best friends growing up, Chris Dorn, his family had an Atari 2600, and it was awesome. I mean, everyone went over to play games at Chris Dorn's house. This was when, especially then, there were no arcades really. I mean, they were just starting arcades back in the late 70s, early 80s. The only place you could really, in Hazeldale, Vancouver, that you could play video games was like the skating rink. And first it was pinball, and then they got video games, and that's when Pac-Man and Donkey Kong and Galaga, and they were a quarter, and you would get your parents to get you $1 or $2. But my dad would always tell me, I don't want you, that's for drinks and food. I don't want you playing those video games. Flash forward to 2 or 3 years later, when my parents were getting a divorce, one of the things we would do when I'd go over there every other weekend was me and my dad, my sister, and maybe Paul or whoever friend I had over, we'd go to the arcade and he would play. He loved Centipede and Dig Dug. But that was like 83, 84. It was such a novelty and so cool with the first video game systems. I mean, this is where you went. He's got an Atari. We got to go there, and maybe, hey, can we come over and play your Atari? It was definitely changed things. And I was good at Pac-Man. I'd probably say Galaga I was the best at when it comes to coin-op video games at the skating rink. A lot of the games on the Atari were nowhere near as good as the games that were in the arcades. Like the Asteroids and Pac-Man and stuff on Atari, they just didn't play the same, and the joystick was really hard to move. But anything back then was like, oh, this is the coolest thing ever. Just the excitement of some of those games. Really back then, for home gaming systems, it was always a comparison to the arcade. The arcade was so much better in graphics and everything, even though the graphics compared to today were horrible. It wasn't until probably the first Nintendo that the arcade level of graphics got sort of achieved. Like Super Mario was just as good as any arcade game as far as graphics goes. Nowadays there's really no arcades, and the computer games or even PlayStation games have way better graphics than anything in an arcade. Then I got a Game Boy. Oh boy. I was 19. It was the Christmas of 1990. It was your mom and I's first Christmas as sort of boyfriend, girlfriend. And my mom got me a Game Boy. It was a black and white handheld little video game. Jen, actually, your mom, didn't even really think that I would play it that much. And my goodness, I mean, just Tetris alone, we played that thing constantly. That thing is the equivalent of your phone now. Your phone's 1,000 times better, but the addiction would be like Candy Crush or Angry Birds or whatever. It was, 4 or 5 times the size of your phone, but the fact that you could turn it on, put 4 batteries in it, have a couple of game cartridges, and sit anywhere and play a video game was amazing.
Game over.